listener production.
The AFLW 2024 season kicks off today, but not everyone's happy with the fixture. After facing public scrutiny, it's expected that the AFL will reschedule the AFLW's Western Bulldogs Round 2 game. It comes after the release of the men's final draw this week, which revealed a timing clash with the club's men's team. The timing made it near impossible for Western Bulldogs fans to make both games. So why do things like this keep happening to the women's comp? Even with grassroots supports growing and girls making up 1/3 of Auskick players, AFLW seems to sometimes get the pointy end of the stick. And the fixture is so important because crowd numbers are part of the collective bargaining agreement clause that impacts the season being extended or not. So why are there games that are arguably not easy to get to? Georgia Rajic is a sports commentator and reporter. Georgia, can you explain what's been happening with the Western Bulldogs AFL and AFLW teams fixture?
Certainly. So it's the start of the AFLW season and it's a really exciting time for the Western Bulldogs. They've done this massive refurbishment to Whitten Oval. And so for round 2, they were having this huge homecoming and celebration because Whitten Oval is such an important part to, football in Western Melbourne, but also really historically to the club. But what has happened in the AFL men's is that the final between Hawthorn and Bulldogs, an elimination final, also incredibly important for their fans, has been scheduled on the same night, meant to be kicking off 2 hours after the women's was meant to start. So it's a really hard situation, not only for the fans and supporters, but also for the staff, because many of those staff would be expected to work across both teams for their club. But the decision did come out on Thursday that the AFL is moving the women's game from the homecoming to be a double header with the men's at the MCG. And it is really interesting because the AFLW has so many set metrics against its success, especially when it comes to attendance. It needs that average of 5,000 and broadcast views around 100,000. So there was a discussion with Paul Marsh, the CEO of the Australian Players, the AFL Players Association, about the fact that potentially the game would be discounted against those metrics so that it wouldn't count towards whether there's an extra game next season or not. But in the end, the game has been moved to the MCG. And there's a lot of stuff to be said about the AFLWs that so many of these games do happen in the traditional community grounds and really important places tied to these clubs' history. But instead, now it's been moved to the MCG, and it is an opportunity to watch more AFLW there, but it also really puts the league in a situation where, the women are the precursor, they're the entree for what the men's is. I understand it is a final here as well, but it also means that the numbers might be incredibly hard to gauge. It, again, feels like the AFLW is an afterthought. We do know that the Western Bulldogs did specifically ask for the game to be put on a Saturday, and it is interesting because Sydney in the men's did finish the minor premiers, so you would think that they would get the blockbuster Friday night game, but the AFL has now just come out and moved the game to be a double header, which in some places I would say would be good to see the women play at the G, but I also just feel like it's just the worst of every situation because it's going to be incredibly hard for the fans to be able to get there on time. It's a Friday night. And also it just doesn't have that, gravitas that what the round 2 was meant to be for the Western Bulldogs women's team.
Is this a bad look for the AFL to have this blunder right at the start of the AFLW season?
I think it is. And I think the reason why it's such a blunder is it's an entirely avoidable situation because if the men's was only announced as the schedule on Monday this week, the AFLW fixture has been out already for some time. So it's not like this wasn't a known thing that was already happening. And, Western Bulldogs also did ask if potentially the game could be moved to 11 a.m. on the Saturday. So there was heaps of different options put forward to try and avoid such a situation. And also there were other options available to the AFL as well. But it will be really interesting. I hope there is a really decent crowd there as well to cheer on the Western Bulldogs ahead of the final. But it does seem like a mess that could have been avoided.
So why can't we seem to still figure out the fixture?
It's a really interesting question to me because you look at the fixture this season, there is an extra round, but there's no extra week. So the season goes for the same amount of time. And I think predominantly the main issue across the board for the AFLW fixture in question is the fact that it's really hard for it to overlap with other seasons. There's talk about grounds availability. And of course, heading into summer, AFL is not a sport that is really, easily played in hard weather conditions, especially with heat. I work in the A-League women's space and we've we've seen predominantly about, changing game times, especially those 3 p.m. Saturday kickoffs, because it's not beneficial to the players, the fans, or anyone to be out there in the sun in the heat of summer in Australia. But you also look at the fixturing for for the extra game we're getting this season. And there are games that are going to be at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday in Frankston, but there's also 5 p.m. Cranbourne midweek games. And it's a lot of questions to be asked about that, specifically about, how are we going to get people there, how can people miss work? But also, just speaking very, as a Melburnian, how are you going to get there in traffic? What time do you have to leave to be able to get to that game? Because travelling out to those places, we know the roads here are quite busy in peak hour, even if it's school holidays. It's going to be an hour and a half drive if you're coming from, central Melbourne to try and get out there, just because of the amount of traffic on the roads.
And you mentioned before there's crowd numbers are part of this collective bargaining agreement clause that impacts the season being extended or not, and it impacts, the future of AFLW. So having these midweek games and games that start at 5 p.m, is that not self-sabotaging for the women's branch?
You can't help but feel like it almost is at times. And I know there was a great conversation in the Outer Sanctum as well about the fact that when we had those COVID years, we had a lot of footy in midweek, and that was really well regarded. But I think there's this question being placed about how are we actually going to get people there to get those numbers, to get those metrics? Because are people going to be expected to work from home so they can turn into the broadcast to get the numbers there? But I guess the main, priority there was, because it was school holidays, there was already that opportunity for a lot of people to, not be at work and to actually get down to the game at that time.
And speaking of women's sports, what are we looking at with crowd numbers? How is the support on the ground?
Well, the average was around 2,500 for game attendance last year. The Sydney Swans really did knock that out of the park. They are averaging in the high 4,000s, and, their last game of the season, they had 5,200 people. So they have really built their home base out of Henson Park and North Sydney Oval. They're playing at North Sydney Oval this week, and they've really made that whole game day experience. Seen so many of my friends talk about how exciting it is to go to that Sydney Swans game. The whole culture of the game day experience has been brilliant. But, Emma Moore, the new general manager for the AFLW, has said that expecting a 25% increase in attendance this season, which is great to hear. Potentially, I'm going to be heading out to Windy Hill this Saturday to watch the Bombers play, and they're expecting 3,000 to 5,000. So it does sound like there is a massive boost. And we've seen around the grounds in other sports in recent years, especially A-League Women and the Suncorp Super Netball, they've been smashing attendance records, getting above 300,000 attendees for their season. We saw about 280,000 for the AFLW last year. So potential to keep moving forward.
And you mentioned there Emma Moore. She's the new head of AFLW. What do we know about her, and do we have a sense of the direction she's wanting to take AFLW?
Well, she's still pretty new to the role, so I think this might be a hard season to really gauge her impact. I think we're going to see a lot more of what she wants next year. She has come from NAB, which are the major sponsor of the AFLW, so she has been involved in the sport for quite some time. But it is interesting to see, she wrote an article for the Herald Sun about how this is going to be the best season yet, and also spoke about the importance of the growth in the community game as well. Participation for women has gone up 20%. We're seeing almost a third of Auskick participants now being girls, and we're also seeing a massive development and growth in the officials in the game as well. So it does seem like there is a real, bottom to top approach, making sure that all aspects of the game will be covered. But I think the real thing with Emma Moore's involvement in the game, we'll definitely see that really to play in future seasons.
So taking all of that in mind with timings and fixtures and support for AFLW, what do you say to people who say women's AFL is just not as good as men's AFL?
I asked them if they've even watched it, because that's the big thing. If you come along, you watch the games, you get to enjoy the environment, because it is footy. It is proper footy. And what we're also seeing now that, as we reach season 9 of the AFLW, that the opportunities that potentially weren't around for a lot of the players to begin with in pathways, and especially in girls' participation years, we're seeing that there are strong systems and competitions all the way through. So they're not missing any key years of development, which a lot of players were 10 years ago. They have been able to play since they first picked up a footy potentially as a toddler and then gone all the way through. So it is a great time to get involved. And with all the games, personally speaking, as someone who lives in quite central Melbourne, being at these community grounds, it does feel like you have such a great connection to the players as well.
Yeah, and I know that grassroots development is so important. I know we spoke off air that when I was in high school and when you were back in school, that you weren't actually able to play AFLW in year 12 or year 11. It wasn't really a thing then. It was just for the boys. So seeing that grassroots involvement and support is really great, and it will only build the game. If you did have a magic wand, though, what would you change about the AFLW?
I would honestly love to see more games. I think it's really hard at the moment with 11 games in 10 weeks. I think it makes it such a short season that if you get off to a bad start, you pretty much know you're not going to make it to finals if you support particular teams or that. So I do want to see that little bit of an extension in. We are seeing, the player payments have been boosted significantly. There's also, we talk about these players coming through who've never had to miss out on pathway opportunities. There are players who are now coming through who will never have to work multiple jobs just to be able to play this sport. So I think my thing about this as well is it would be great if this was just we had a couple more games in the season, which I'm sure plenty of other AFLW fans also agree with, just because I feel like it goes in the blink of an eye.
And what are you looking forward to this season? Who are the teams or players that we should watch out for?
Well, really interesting stat about the AFLW is the team that has finished the runner-up in the grand final, those who have not won, have gone on to win it the following year. So North Melbourne lost to Brisbane at Icon Park. However, they have had a brilliant VFLW season. They won that as well, and they didn't even use any of their AFLW listed players. That's the depth of their current squad. So I think they're much really the team to beat and look out for. My other pick is, and I've seen a lot of people talk about this, is Jazz Gardner has not won a league best in Ferris, but she's been in ripping form. So I think potentially this is also her year to do so.
Amazing. Georgia, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was sports commentator Georgia Rajic. Thanks for listening to The Briefing. That's it for this episode. But before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it too, or subscribe to The Briefing podcast wherever you get your podcast from. It really does help other people find us. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.